Good morning, everyone.
Yeah.
And happy new academic year. My name is Jorrit de Jong. I'm the director of the Bloomberg Center for Cities here at Harvard. We are a university-wide center and working with all schools and all disciplines and convening people who study cities, who work in cities. And today it is my pleasure to introduce this event and the lab and professor presenting it to you on this very first day of the new academic year. Before we get started, a warm welcome to everybody who's watching this online and or after the fact in the recording. We have not just the first day of the academic year, but also election season is upon us. Today is election day, and of course, the conversation about elections are heating up, and this is a very timely event. The Local Politics Lab is presenting the TrueViews project with the Election Law Clinic at the Harvard Law School. And it's my pleasure to introduce the person who put it all together, Professor Justin de Benedictis Kessner. He's an associate professor here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and his Local Politics Lab is studying things that are most important to cities: housing, policing, economic development, climate change, and so forth. He's also studying the ways in which voters can hold politicians accountable for making progress on these policy issues, and he is studying how public opinion shapes policy and vice versa. And he's brought together a fantastic panel with very accomplished scholars as well as city leaders. And I will turn over to him to introduce the panel. Please join me in welcoming Professor de Benedictis Kessner.
Thanks, guys, for being here. It's my pleasure to start the Local Politics Lab. I get to introduce this fantastic panel behind me, who are all accomplished in their own right and all coming together here for TrueViews today, which hopefully you guys are excited about as well. So behind me, all the way on the left, is Ruth Greenwood. Ruth is an assistant clinical professor of law and director of the Election Law Clinic at Harvard Law School. She engages in litigation and advocacy on a variety of election law cases, and trains the next generation of election lawyers here at Harvard Law School. So really excited to have her here. We also have Chris Warshaw. Chris Warshaw is a professor of political science at George Washington University, where he focuses his research on American politics, representation, public opinion, state and local politics, environmental politics and policy, and statistical methods. He's a frequent collaborator of mine, so I'm really excited to have him here today. He earned his PhD and JD from Stanford, and has received numerous awards for his work in political science. But most important for today's conversation, the latest and greatest thing that Chris has done is create all the data that is behind TrueViews.com, and which we're going to talk about today. Finally, all the way over here on the right is Michelle de la Isla. Michelle is the CEO of Hack Diversity, a movement to create opportunities for the next generation in tech. Prior to her role at Hack Diversity, Michelle worked as the managing director of the Richards Kaplan Foundation, the diversity inclusion representative with We Start Energy, and most importantly, again, for today's conversation, Michelle was the mayor of Topeka from 2018 to 2022, and before that, a councilwoman from Topeka from 2013 to 2018. Finally, for today, we've got Nick Stephanopoulos, the Kirkland & Ellis Professor of Law, who's going to come up here in a second. But Nick is an expert on election law, constitutional law, administrative law, legislation, and comparative law. He is the author most recently of the book Aligning Election Law, which just came out in 2024. And he's been involved in a number of litigation efforts, including 2 partisan gerrymandering cases based on his scholarship that have been decided by the Supreme Court. He's a co-founder of PlanScore, alongside actually Ruth and Chris as well, a website that evaluates past, present, and proposed districting plans, as well as a co-founder of TrueViews, which we're going to talk about today and which he's going to introduce us to next. So, welcome, Nick.
All right, terrific. Thanks very much, Justin. Thanks also to Jorrit and the Bloomberg Center for Cities, both for organizing this event and also for financially supporting TrueViews. It's really not an exaggeration that without the Bloomberg Center, none of this would be happening right now. It would just be an idea in the minds of Ruth and Chris and Justin and me. So I'm very excited to talk about TrueViews and its potential for improving representation today. I'll start by covering some background facts about American politics that motivated the TrueViews project. And then I'll go into some of the capabilities of TrueViews itself. So let me start off. As everyone here probably knows, contemporary American politicians are highly polarized. Most Democratic politicians today are liberals. Most Republican politicians today are conservatives. And there's very little ideological overlap between Democratic and Republican politicians. This slide is for the current US House of Representatives, but the same result holds for many other governmental institutions today. However, American voters today are not nearly as polarized as American politicians. In fact, most American voters today remain relatively ideologically moderate. This is some data from a project that Chris was involved in, reporting about a decade's worth of surveys. And you can see year after year, the distribution of voter ideology looks pretty much normal and centered on the midpoint of the ideological distribution. So there's a really profound mismatch between polarized politicians today and much more moderate voters. So there are a lot of potential explanations for this mismatch, but one of them, maybe a powerful explanation, is that many politicians misperceive the views and preferences of their voters. They often think that voters are much more ideologically extreme than voters actually are. So this chart here, or these charts, are for state legislators. And you can see on the y-axis the politicians' perceptions of district opinion. On the x-axis, true district opinion. The red line is for Republican state legislators. The blue line is for Democratic state legislators. And the black line denotes accurate perceptions of district opinion. And you can see that the blue line, and especially the red line in all of these charts, is quite far from the black line indicating correct perceptions of district opinion. Republican state legislators in particular tend to hugely overestimate the conservatism of their constituents. And this is probably one driver of polarization and poor representation today. You might think, well, even if politicians themselves aren't deeply familiar with district opinion, maybe staffers who work for the politicians are better. Another recent study looks at congressional staffers' perceptions of congressional district opinion and tells the same story as the previous slide. So Democratic and Republican staffers give wildly different estimates of district opinion on major federal policies. And both Democratic and Republican staffers get it hugely wrong. Their estimates are way off the 45-degree line here that, again, denotes correct appraisals of district opinion. So these studies suggest a really intriguing hypothesis, right? If misperceptions of district opinion are one driver of polarization and poor representation, maybe if we better informed politicians about district opinion, we would dampen polarization and improve representation. The best evidence we have that this hypothesis might actually hold comes from a study out of New Mexico a few years ago. There was a big pending fiscal proposal in New Mexico. A pair of scholars ran a large-scale survey of public opinion in New Mexico on this fiscal proposal. And the survey was big enough to generate estimates of public opinion within each state house district in the state. And so the scholars then shared these estimates of public opinion with one set of randomly chosen state legislators, but not another set. And among the treatment group, the politicians who got this data, their eventual votes on this fiscal proposal were highly responsive to public opinion in their districts. The more that their constituents supported the fiscal proposal, the more likely the politicians were to vote for the bill. On the other hand, in the control group, when they didn't get this data about public opinion, there was no consistent relationship between what voters wanted on this bill and what the representatives actually did. So, that's a great study, really promising. Unfortunately, we usually don't have that kind of district level public opinion data. Most of the time, at all sub-national levels of governance in America, politicians and journalists and staffers are lacking accurate data about what people think about different policies within states, within districts, and within cities and counties and other local levels or local units of government. So the hope of TrueViews is for the first time to provide lots of this public opinion data on specific policies at lots of geographic levels. And the hope is to hugely generalize that New Mexico experiment I talked about, to make available this data everywhere in American politics, and thereby to try to boost representation and combat polarization that's not a good fit for more moderate constituents. So TrueViews is currently based on 18 big national surveys conducted over the last 15 years or so, with more than 1 million respondents among them. Chris, behind me, used a state-of-the-art method known as multi-level regression and post-stratification to generate accurate estimates of public opinion on lots of policies and within lots of geographic units. So that's where the data comes from for TrueViews. Currently, TrueViews covers 11 different policy areas. These are the policy areas that were covered by the big national surveys that I just mentioned. And the areas are criminal justice, drugs, education, environment, gun control, healthcare, immigration, LGBTQ rights, minimum wage, reproductive rights, and taxes. In total, there are 32 specific policies that TrueViews currently offers opinion estimates on. And as I think should be clear, these policies are relevant to all levels of American politics. They're not limited to federal politics, for example. They're absolutely applicable to state and also to local politics. The geographic coverage of TrueViews is also extensive. And that's because American governance is multi-level governance. We need to know public opinion within lots of different geographic and administrative units if we're going to realize the potential of TrueViews at multiple levels of government. So TrueViews currently covers zip codes, city and towns, other county subdivisions, counties themselves, states, school districts, state legislative districts, both upper and lower house, and congressional districts. And again, obviously, these geographic units pertain to federal, state, and local politics. TrueViews also offers state pages, which differ from the main national front page in a few respects. Unlike the front page, the state pages show public opinion over time from 2009 to the present. For those of you that want access to the data in sort of tabular form, not just map form, there are also tables of public opinion by geographic unit on the state pages. And if you really want to zoom in and learn a lot about a particular geographic unit, your own town, your own school district, what have you, you can click on that geographic unit and get all the data that, TrueViews has about that particular unit. So let me just walk through a few examples of how TrueViews works, the website, and how it could actually help to improve representation. So one of our panelists today, Michelle, used to be the mayor of Topeka, Kansas. So let's suppose that Topeka is considering raising the minimum wage to $15 for employees in the city. And the mayor and city council members in Topeka are debating what to do. One thing they could do, if they could go to TrueViews, let's see, we go select a state, pick Kansas. Once we're in Kansas, we can then find the minimum wage policy area. And let's go to county subdivisions. And let's type in Topeka over here. And we can zoom right into Topeka, Kansas. And when we do that, we find out that about 71% of the residents of Topeka support raising the minimum wage. So of course, this isn't the only information that the mayor and city council members would want about this issue, but it's unquestionably some relevant information which TrueViews is able to make available. Now let's move to state rather than local level representation. We're here in Massachusetts. So let's say that Massachusetts is considering raising taxes on people and families with an income above $250,000 a year. I live in Winchester, Massachusetts. My state house member in the 31st Middlesex District is a guy named Michael Day. What should Michael do on this vote? Well, I can go to taxes. Do you support or oppose raising taxes on families making over $250,000? We click on state lower house, and then let's zoom in and find my state house district. Winchester, Massachusetts. Here's my state house district, and we see that about 56% of people in Winchester support raising taxes on wealthier families. For a final example, at the federal level, Chris on the panel is from Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania. So let's say that Congress is considering building a wall on the southern border with Mexico. And Chris's Congress member, this is District 10 in Pennsylvania, wants to find out what public opinion is within the district. So here's a question about support or opposing the policy of building a wall on the southern border. We go to Congress, we type in Mechanicsburg. Let's see if I get this right. It finds Mechanicsburg, and here we are. We find out that about 52% of the residents of District 10 in Pennsylvania support building a wall on the southern border. You can see this district is a little bit more liberal than some of the other districts around it in central Pennsylvania. So again, this is far from the only relevant information for the congressman from District 10, Scott Perry, but it's likely something he and other members of Congress would want to consider. And again, TrueViews makes it possible for the first time for all of these elected officials and their staffers and activists and others to know what the public thinks about these issues at different levels of government. Thanks a lot.
All right, thank you, Nick. To be clear, we live in Winchester because we're married. Okay, so I am now going to ask a couple of questions of the panelists before we then move to audience questions. And you can ask those questions here in this room, but I also have the online questions up, and I see they're already coming in. Where is it live on the internet? Well, I can answer that, trueviews.org. Okay, so I'm going to start with you, Mayor Michelle. I feel like Nick kind of maligned you guys in his presentation. Legislators don't know what their constituents want. Staffers are ignorant. I want to give you a chance to maybe defend yourself. When you were in office, was it hard to know what your constituents' office? Like, what were the methods that you used to get a sense of what constituents wanted?
So thank you for the question. I think that for political leaders that lose touch with their constituencies, it's extremely hard. I think that one of the things that I heard over and over when I was door knocking in the community was, oh, you're in this neighborhood now. We've never seen the mayor in this community after they've been elected. And Jorrit, God bless him, and Dave used to receive like a binder of me every quarter with me giving them reports of me having to go back into those communities that never saw a mayor just to go. And I would just surprise people and be like, hey, we would go door knocking, we would leave a whole bunch of leaflets, and then we show up on a weekend and we would bring hot dogs, bring like burgers, and just sit with people and just listen to what they were saying. And that is the only way that we were able to have enough data to understand what the constituents needed. And the powerful thing that it wasn't just the 20% constituents that show up in your city hall and like are taking up your time in public comment saying the same thing over and over, which gets people to do the polarized versions that we're seeing in the community. You end up, if you don't actually reach out, you end up missing the vast majority of the moderate individuals that are in your constituency because they're not out there speaking loudly.
Yeah, thank you. So Chris, you are the magician that made all the data happen. It's probably not magic. You guys are all quanti. You know how it happens. But there's a lot of talk today with it beginning the election season, according to BUR this morning, about public opinion and the polls that are out and whether they're right or they're wrong or can we really know anything. So I guess my question for you is, you've pulled all this data. It's up on the website. We can look at it. Can we trust it? What does it tell us? Like, can we believe what it says about the issue? Can we use that to infer anything about any other issues? Do tell.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think pollsters are obviously continuously working on improving their methods. So I think there's a couple ways that we can know that these are relatively accurate. So one is that at the state and national level, in general, they match other polls that are out there. So these are not here. We know the estimates here don't diverge in a substantial way from other well-respected polls. What this does enable us to do that most polls can't is get to a much higher level of granularity. So we can zoom in to the local level in a way that you just can't from a national poll, from Gallup, or from some other national pollster. We also know they're accurate because for presidential elections, we don't show it on the site, but I've used the same methodology to predict presidential elections, and the methods work really well there. And the final thing I should say is the methods that we use in the site, I didn't invent them. This is based on a long literature of articles in political science and in the survey methodology literature. So really what we're doing is at scale, we're using methods that have been developed by a big community of academics, but then using them hopefully to produce estimates that are useful for a broad set of groups.
Awesome. Okay, back to Michelle, which is now what I'm calling you. So one of the sort of theories of this website, as Nick outlined, is that if local legislators actually knew more about what their constituents wanted, it would help them to govern more in line with those views. There's that study about that. But in terms of your experience on the ground, I would love to get a sense of whether you think this is something that could inform legislators to what to do, or could it help to give them cover for them wanting to do something that they know the 20% that you mentioned, the very vocal 20% are harassing them. Could they use this and say, I hear you 20%, but when I look and see what everybody else, like how is this going to get used by representatives?
So in quoting Hamilton, can I be real a second for just a millisecond? Look, the reality is that this data is beautiful. And if we were to live in a world in which people actually cared about data, especially when, right? Thank you. Come on, preach, let's testify. If people actually cared about data, they would actually look for a reputable source, like these beautiful human beings that are here who have collected the data just because they're concerned about the state of the economy. The problem that we end up having is at the moment of you going into an election process, you end up having your people give you the data that they told you that is the data that you need to do. And the even worse issue is the fact that because so many people that are being represented here are so disenfranchised, they're not voting anymore. And what ends up happening is that we say, like you said, Justin was saying, hey, it shows, here's the graph showing how here's the views of the constituency, here's the views of the right, and here's the views of the left. Everybody's off. But what ends up happening is that we have a repetition over and over of the people that get elected that demonstrate the opposite. So in a perfect world, we would engage other people to vote if we actually saw that they were being heard, right? If there was actually some sort of contact with somebody other than my echo chamber, which is what you all are providing. The sad reality is that I would hope that anybody that's running for office and is in office would use this tool, because I think it would change. It would help people understand that you will create more voter engagement. The question is, do they want that?
Yeah, this is leads perfectly into my question for Chris, which is, okay, so legislators, some of them are going to be amazing and use this, and many of them are not. We had hoped that this tool would be available for journalists, citizen activists. I wonder if you can comment on how this tool could be used by those other people, particularly in the context of election campaigns that we're seeing right now.
Well, let me get to there in a second. I just want to make 2 more additions to my earlier answer, really quick.
Please do.
One is I want to emphasize the uncertainty. One of the things that we show on the site, for all of the data we put on the site, we show confidence intervals, so you can get a sense of how precise the estimates are. And at the state level, the estimates are often fairly precise, but as you go down in geography, they get less precise. And I think that's important just to understand. That's just the nature of all polling data. As you have smaller geographic areas and fewer people, you're going to have more uncertainty. And one of the things that I think we really worked hard on in the site is to properly show that uncertainty. The other thing I think we mentioned implicitly for the site, but this is a truly nonpartisan site. And one of the things that we worked hard at is to show issues, make sure we're showing the full realm of public opinion data. So there's some issues where there's big liberal majorities. There's other issues where there's big conservative majorities. And you can really look at the site and see that full realm of issues across the political spectrum that have both liberal and conservative majorities. And I think that's important. So now to turn into your question. So I think that for journalists, what we want to show here is to give them the context so that when they're covering issues or covering politics at the local level, they can see, do 52% of people in central Pennsylvania support a border wall? And I think that's going to affect maybe how they view the candidate's statements and how they cover that issue. Whereas in other places, maybe it's, maybe in Cambridge, Massachusetts, only 20% support building a border wall or something. So we hope this information really gives journalists information that'll provide more context for their coverage.
Yeah, and I'll add as well, presumably you will all do what I did, which is go into where you live and check out what your neighbors think and see whether they agree with you or not. It's fun.
And I think the alternative here for journalists is they either have zero information, which obviously isn't great, or they rely on one sort of one-off poll that had, maybe only had a couple hundred respondents and it was of dubious quality. And I think, over-extrapolate from that one poll. We're really trying to show them the universe of public opinion information from high-quality academic polls. So they're not just cherry-picking the results from one, maybe sub-quality poll.
Okay, I'm going to hand back to Justin, but I might actually ask you a question, seeing as I'm the moderator of this. I wonder if, Nick mentioned the study at the local level of how these data were used, and that was at the state legislative level. I wonder if this is the kind of thing that the local politics lab could study. I mean, could you use this for a look at a mayor, or look at mayors compared to each other, or city councillors? I mean, I don't know, can you?
Yeah, that's a great idea. And actually, someone just emailed me about it over the weekend about doing this. And so Chris and I may have our hands full with a new project very, very soon. One of the things I've learned from working with lots of Harvard Kennedy School students over the years and with city governments is that often cities do not have any data on what their constituents think. City governments are often understaffed and under-resourced and can't run their own polls on important public opinion issues. And so they're left without any kind of data. So not just maybe going out into the community, but maybe they don't have time before they act on an issue. And so it might be especially important for local governments to have this as a tool, I'd say. And it would be great to study this empirically. So I'm trying to resist new projects right now, but it's hard to resist one that could be as important as this.
Okay, I think it's over to you to moderate questions. There's a whole lot online, but do you want me to give you one of the first ones from online, or who in the room has questions?
If anyone in the room has questions, maybe we start off with one online, yeah.
Okay, so I think one that's been asked by a couple of people is, does TrueViews stay up to date? I see that the survey ends in 2023. What are you going to do around shifting public opinion over time? I feel like that's probably a question for Chris.
Yeah.
So typically the way academic surveys work is there's 2024 surveys in progress right now, and they'll get released after the election. And when the new public opinion data from 2024 is released to academic researchers, we'll incorporate it into the site, which will probably happen in early 2025.
Yeah, right here.
So what's being done to like market it, or like how are we getting the word out? Oh, sorry, I'll repeat. Just how it's being marketed to get the word out.
This is the first marketing event. Welcome. Also, our plan is to do outreach through groups like the National Conference of State Legislators, what's the cities one?
National League of Cities. I know some of them are tuning in online today.
Yeah, actually, you might be here listening to this. So the hope would be to get to journalists and to legislators. But if I'm not a marketing, I have not studied marketing, nor am I a marketing genius. So if you have ideas, we're all ears.
In the back there, yeah.
Hi. To the point made earlier about incentives and practicality, I realized a lot of the look that we had was practicality on the back end of informing legislators. But has there been any looking into how this data could be used to maybe adjust voting procedures to see this mismatch of public opinion versus voting for these representatives? So instead of informing the legislators as they make laws, maybe changing the way in which legislators are elected.
I love that idea. Maybe we can have more citizens' councils, sortition, all of the things that the Kennedy School loves to study. We haven't looked at that yet. Part of promoting this to the world is seeing what bright students can think about doing. I think that it's certainly one area that I have of interest in terms of my work in local government is looking at election systems other than first past the post and other than at large first past the post. And there's some modeling that can be done around things like ranked choice voting, cumulative limited voting. And I imagine you could, I don't know what the data side, but you could link up, right, the likely outcomes in terms of candidates with the views of the constituency and maybe use that as a way to show that that's a fairer system. Now, when it comes to making change at the local level, just saying this would be fairer kind of gets you nowhere. But at least we could talk to the community about that, right? Because explaining election systems is, I barely understand them, let alone explaining it to community members who have 10,000 things in their lives to do. But yeah, I think that's a really interesting application.
I was just going to tag onto that. One thing that this reminds me of is what Michelle was saying that she did as a council member and mayors, going out into the community proactively to gather opinion from people who you're not hearing from. This site could hopefully tell you that maybe if you're hearing from people in public comment periods at a city council meeting in one direction and really strong opinions, that maybe you're not capturing the whole views of the community. And you need to actually proactively go out to certain other communities that you're not reaching, because you can look at TrueViews and say, hey, the community as a whole looks different from what I'm hearing in this city council meeting. So hopefully that might be useful for someone like you or other city leaders who are doing this type of work.
And the last thing I was going to say is another part, flipping the coin of your question, is right now the site self-consciously focuses on policy issues in the sense of things that affect people's everyday lives, kind of. We haven't focused on electoral systems and people's opinions of them. But one thing we might add to the future is do most people support nonpartisan redistricting commissions? Or do people support vote by mail laws or voter ID laws? Various election reform kind of initiatives. That could be something we add to the site in the future.
Yeah, right here.
Hi, I wanted to follow up on what you said, Michelle, about going to the community, having a perfect world where data is valued. So having worked for elected officials, and this, they care about constituents and constituents that vote. Mm-hmm. So the data might show that the community 70% support XYZ, and you vote that way. But the 20% are pissed off about it, or 30% are pissed off this issue, and 20 of those actually vote, and most of the 70% don't vote. How do you overcome that? Because ultimately, that's what's going to matter.
I think that they mentioned something very powerful, which is this information should not only be available, which it is, it's available broadly, but the locus of information should not just be for the elected official. I think it should also be for the media. And I think that that is where healthy media comes in. And if they are empowered with information, it changes the narrative. Because it's really powerful if you say, oh, the council members ended up voting very much aligned with what the 5 cats that showed up today and yelled about it said, right? It's like, okay, meow, meow, meow. We all know the song. Okay, but guess what happens? All of a sudden, now you have this very high integrity local journalistic outlet that actually went to the website. Sorry, I don't remember the full TrueViews. Thank you. Went to TrueViews, and all of a sudden they realize that, oh, the 5 cats that spoke had nothing to say with regards to what the community is saying. And that is the true role of journalism right there. And if they have the power of information that is unbiased information that they could actually show and say, here is what people are actually saying, then you create a sentiment in the community that they should speak up. But right now, because we don't have these connections, journalists don't have unbiased media to rely on, they end up saying the same things that keep people disenfranchised from voting.
I've got an online question here.
Sure.
Given the recent UNICEF USA and Harris Poll survey where youth aged 14 to 22 expressed that their views don't matter to policymakers, how effectively is TrueViews capturing the perspectives of this age group as well as children aged 7 to 14 and the parents of younger children? Okay, Chris. Come on, magic up some more data.
Well, we should say by design, the site focuses on the the American citizens that are older than 17. So that's our population. That's generally our population frame, so to speak. So we consciously don't include young people that are younger than 18. But we do have many young adults. And one thing, we haven't talked about this very much, but one thing we could do in the future is maybe break down public opinion by demographic group a little bit more than we do right now. Because certainly going into our statistical model is people's age and breaking them down by different age groups.
We had a question right here in the front. Do you want to go for it?
Do you worry that elected officials might over-rely on TrueViews data and lead to maybe a tyranny of the majority, where they see that over 50% of their constituents believe in a certain policy, and so they just vote the way that they see the community and data reflects that?
That's an awesome question. I am teaching Laini Guinier's Tyranny of the Majority tonight to my law school class, so I am ready on this. Yes, it could lead to that, but a tyranny of the majority, as opposed to a tyranny of the cats that Michelle has talked about, seems like a better place to start from, and then make amendments to. I guess I would also hope that if you see that it's 52%, you know that 48% don't agree, and Laini Guinier would say, why don't we take turns, right? Maybe we don't put up a wall and take down a wall, that you can't really take turns in that. But there are ways that you can incorporate minority views and not only do what the majority wants the whole time. And that gets a little bit back into the system of representation that you have.
And I think from the point of view you talked about earlier about polarization, I think it gives both partisan sides like a gut check. That often people kind of assume that their side is always the most popular. And I think, that's not true. There's lots of situations where people support the conservative side. There's other situations where people support the liberal side. And I think that's useful information for politicians and journalists.
And what I want to just bring up is the fact that we end up electing individuals with the hope that when we heard them speak, they actually aligned with our point of views or that we had some sort of commonality. I think that the one thing that we hope that our political leaders have is some sense of integrity, right? And at some point, you're going to see data that is 50-50. And as a leader, you have to sit with yourself and figure out what the best thing is for the community. So for individuals that actually end up having the opportunity of having the data, my hope would be is that their integrity then starts kicking in and they do a gut check and think about whether the policy is a sexy policy that people like or a policy that has people divided. The question should always be in the heart of somebody that's leading is this the best thing for my constituency? And my hope is that what we would end up having is more people having better data so that those gut checks come in when that happens and it's not just a tyranny of the majority.
Great.
Fascinating tool, fascinating conversation. I know that both Chris and Justin have worked on survey design. What should polling organizations take away from this? We talked about politicians, we talked about voters, but the data comes from the surveys that collect the data, and the way these questions are framed, the way policy alternatives are being presented, informs what data come out. So what is the ideal feedback mechanism that feeds back into the survey design from these polling organizations?
Come on, data geeks. What's your answer?
I'll let Justin take that first.
Oh, thank you. It's so nice of you. One thing that I would hope that polling organizations take away from this is actually, I don't want to talk about shortcomings of TrueViews yet, but one thing that we don't have much of is broad national polls on hyper-local policy issues. And so what I would hope that pollsters take away from this is the need to ask more questions about the policy issues that actually are the decisions that local government leaders are making instead of just state and federal government officials. And so I would love to be able to include, lots of different policy issues like on housing development. But because large polls that we're using for TrueViews don't ask these kinds of questions, we can't include those types of policies yet. So that's my takeaway for pollsters.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. We're mostly focused here on national and state level issues because that's what national polls mostly ask about. So I think including more issues that are relevant to local policymakers on polls would be really terrific.
I just want to jump in and say that if anybody's a pollster and you want to take that on, you absolutely should. We've already had my latest favorite person, Cynthia Dybala, says, as an elected city council member in a small city, I like the idea of a project that assesses the usefulness of this data. So she's ready to work with you. She says, I also agree with the statement that the local level, virtually no data is available. NLC could be a great partner, and I am on their board. So boom, we're doing it here today, people.
Right here.
Thank you for your great work. I do research on question of, is the polarization going from top down, from elite to grassroots, or is it bottom up at some point? And using your data, one way to maybe frame the analysis might be, there's some House of Representatives districts like AOCs and Marjorie Greene's, Taylor Greene's, they may be playing to a national audience to get attention and coverage, and then maybe perhaps winning the local election. Does those politicians, do they shift public opinion maybe over the course of many years? Are they shifting the local grassroots to a more extreme opinion? Would that be possible?
I think certainly using these big surveys, that would be possible. I think it could be possible with our data. The statistical tools we're using shrink away some of that year-to-year change because we're trying to generate them. We're doing what's called a bias variance trade-off to get the most accurate estimates we can. So we'd have to think a little bit more about the statistical methodology, but certainly these surveys can be used to answer those kinds of questions.
Back here.
Hi. So thinking about mismatch, I think like anecdotally something I've seen is like there's a lot more money being spent on local elections, whether that's by corporations, lobbies. And so I was thinking more about like how maybe TrueViews can shift, whether that's getting new candidates on or whatever, the conversation back to voters and issues and kind of address that. I don't know if that's something you guys thought about.
Well, I think one thing I would say is that we're seeing more and more issues that are addressed at the state and local level. And that's partly because of polarization in Washington. If Congress can't pass legislation, then sort of, by necessity, somebody has to address these problems. And that's increasingly going to be state and local governments. And so we're not in a world anymore where you can run one CBS News poll at the national level and get a sense of like what Congress should do. If it's being devolved to the state and local level, then we need accurate information about how what the public wants at the subnational and sub-state level. And so we're hopeful that we can provide one tool for people to do that.
Yeah, I'll just add in some of the work that I do around towns, cities, and counties, I was looking at the site and thinking about how they could use some of these data. And one you wouldn't think necessarily that like a local town could implement immigration in any meaningful way, but actually they can, right? So a community I worked with out in Yakima, Washington, refused to have ICE use its like airplane landing strip to do deportation flights. It was like, you're not doing them from here, go find somewhere else, right? That was a way that they could stand up for the immigration policies preferred by the people of Yakima. And so I think that Chris is right that this is happening. And once you start looking into it, I think there are, it would be nice to get housing policy and other things, but there's actually a lot of these seemingly national level policies that can be affected at a local level.
Yeah, another great example for that is climate change policy. So the Inflation Reduction Act gets a lot of attention as a federal level policy, but all of that money is flowing through state and local governments. And so I've worked with cities in the local Boston area about how they're going to implement these infrastructure changes. It's all happening at the local level. And they could use data from a place like TrueViews to tell them how their constituents think about this. And like you said, it could definitely bring us back to some of the issues that local governments are actually deciding on. Got a question right here.
Thank you for your awesome comments and discussion. I'm Manisha from MCMPA 23, and I'm curious to know, anyone of you can answer this, of course, whether after the Affordable Act, health is still considered to be a state or federal, or we would want to listen to conversations which are happening at the local government, and what would that look like and mean like?
Who knows anything about health policy?
Well, I think what we can say is that, obviously the Affordable Care Act was a national policy, but the Supreme Court devolved it in part to the states, right? So whether they accept, for instance, the Medicaid expansion. So having reliable information over time about how public opinion on the Medicaid expansion is changing, I think is a really important example of how TrueViews and tools like TrueViews can be used to improve representation. Reproductive rights is obviously another example where the Supreme Court has devolved that policy largely to the states. And so having a sense of, what percentage of people in a given state support or are pro-choice versus pro-life or have sort of other views on reproductive rights, I think is really important for public policy.
A great example of that is Kansas.
Yeah.
Right.
Sadly, Kansas has not been able to get passed for us to be able to accept the funding from the ACA, but Kansas's voters demonstrated their importance for reproductive rights when the legislature overwhelmingly very conservative, and they were not able to add to the Constitution making abortion illegal. So again, this is great information for people to have. I just wish they used it.
Thank you. This is phenomenal data, and it's very exciting with everything that I think it makes possible. We saw at the beginning that a lot of elected officials tend to, whether they do or not, think that they know their constituency really, really well. How do we go about getting them to care about this? The people who are perhaps most obviously in a position to use these data, how do we get them to take advantage of it and to care?
Oh, a little bit of that is hopefully holding an event like this. We have a lot of people tuning in online.
We're doing it right now.
More people from cities like the one that you were talking about, so people know that this is a tool. So we hope that there are lots of strong networks of people who work in, say, city governments, like the National League of Cities, like ICMA, that help provide tools and resources, as does the Bloomberg Center itself, helping train mayors. And so our hope is that they can learn about tools like this and see them as an easy-to-use platform to do. A lot of the work behind TrueViews goes into making it just as easy as possible to use for the average person, not for people who are experts in statistical methodology. Our hope is that we've accomplished that a little bit so that it is actually just easy to use. Getting the word out is something that we're hoping to do more of as well.
First of all, it's your and our responsibility collectively to let people know that we want people to be data informed. And it's really sad that we live in a state of affairs in which we have so much information available to us on our phones, so much information available to us that is reputable. You have these brilliant minds that just wanted to create something for the good of mankind, right? And how do we bring people back together? But until we as constituents start engaging with people and telling them, I expect of you to be a leader that does evidence-based leadership. What people are going to keep on doing is going on emotion. But it's up to us to hold the standard for our leaders. We want evidence-based leadership. The data's there, use it. And if you don't, we'll just vote.
I would say, on a similar vein, another person online said, what opportunities are there for nonprofits to use this as a tool to advance local policies that can be bottom up and help push state and federal policy priorities? So I think, as you say, it's about people, but I do think that the nonprofit world can get in there and help to empower, as you say, the people who are part of the 80% that don't feel like they can speak up. Now we've identified, a view. It's about getting out there and doing sort of organizing in the community to help give everybody a voice rather than just the cats, as I'm now going to continue to call them.
How did you decide on the 11 policy topics?
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
How did you decide on the 11 policy area?
How did you decide on the 11 policy areas?
Yeah.
I think that's for Chris.
I think what we tried to do is include all of the policies from the surveys that are sort of still politically relevant. I mean, there's occasionally surveys will ask about policies that are, feel important in 2009 or something, but are kind of idiosyncratic and sort of well off the political agenda. And because this was a tool designed to inform policymakers today, not 15 years ago, not just purely for academic research, we tried to focus on policies that are relevant today. And so we tried to include all of the policies that met that criteria in our source data and not censor them in some way. And so as I said, some of these policy areas reflect sort of big liberal majorities, other reflect big conservative majorities, and then everywhere in between.
I just want to follow up on that last question about the rollout. My name is Matt. I'm from Montana. And we've watched Montana shift from, I think, a pretty purple state to a pretty red one. And if we understand, obviously, the Senate, that there is a deep bias towards rural states that have a lot of power, even though they don't represent a lot of people, in a state that has about 1 million people and 2 senators, one of which is up for re-election this year. So the point about the rollout piece, I just want to double emphasize on, if you build it, we can't just wait for them to come. And, and I agree that it's all up to us to push for it. But, if this is a pitch to get additional funding from the Bloomberg Center on the rollout strategy, then I'll make it, because, getting this out and making sure that legislators have this and really influencing the ground game is really important, because it's a really powerful tool. I've been texting it to friends that are staffers or county commissioners and things like that, but that's like, one text, and you guys got the power of Harvard behind you. So I really think emphasizing that rollout strategy, if I can. Thanks.
Thank you. I love that. Money, please.
I think, one thing we're also thinking about is the broader changing the status quo of how we think about making policy. And so there's a temporary rollout strategy for a tool like TrueViews, but there's also a little bit of what Michelle was talking about. It's on you, but it's also on the next generation of public leaders. I teach a politics and ethics class here for their MPP students, so stay tuned in the spring if you're an MPP 1. But we talk a lot about how you make decisions when you don't have data, and how you make decisions when you do have data, and how you make a choice between, say, a majority opinion and a minority opinion. And so I think that's a little bit on training the next generation to think of this as the default, is go to the data, go find the evidence. And if you don't have the evidence, go find it another way. And so hopefully we're adding some piece of evidence to that. So changing the default way that decisions are made is a really big step we're trying to make longer term. In the short term, of course, rolling out a tool like this is for sure important, I'd say.
Thank you for the presentation. I want to ask, I have 2 questions, brief questions. One is, as someone that doesn't have much of a quantitative survey background, and you're using these different surveys that you're putting together in these fancy regressions from my understanding. One thing that we do see in surveys is, priming based on questions. So like if you ask, do you approve of the estate tax or do you approve of a death tax? Like you're going to get different results. So I guess the question I have is kind of how do the methods that produce these surveys account for variation across these different series of surveys that are fielded? And also, was foreign policy a consideration of some of those questions being added to the results, or is that something that you're looking at in the future?
Well, in terms of the policy areas, whatever Chris can get us, we will put on the website. In terms of the methodology, you should speak to that.
Well, I think what I'd say, it's a great question. We're only using academic surveys. So these are surveys that are at least, trying to use best practices on question wording, and I don't think there's egregious errors in any of them. But one of the things we try to show on the site is, we show the source questions. So you can judge for yourself. If you think this source question is misleading in some way, we try to reflect it faithfully on the site. And for some policy areas, there's different versions of a question that we include. So reproductive rights is one, where there's a number of different ways, or at least a couple that we are able to show on the site, that survey firms have asked about people's views on abortion. And they don't always yield exactly the same answers. Sometimes question wording does matter a little bit. And we try to, when we can, we show the multiple question wordings rather than trying to artificially collapse them in some way.
Hi, my name is Disha. I had a question on how you all are planning to keep up with the maintenance and making sure that all of the information will be as up to date as possible, especially with this year being an election year and with all of these issues really being highly polarized or really controversial and things changing nonstop. What's sort of your approach and what's your plan to make sure that this will be as current as possible?
What is the plan, Chris?
Well, I think that we should say, we're not aspiring to track the daily news cycle, right? We're not going to be updating the site on a daily or weekly basis to reflect new polls. I think our aspiration is to update it on sort of an annual basis or to reflect major new academic surveys and to gradually add things like foreign policy. So if there's either policy issues or areas we missed, to gradually fill out the site. But I don't think we're going to try to keep up with the daily news cycle.
I just add on that those questions that you mentioned, are the same question is asked over multiple years, I believe, which is why on the state pages you can look at that exact question and how it's been asked over time. Right. So for future issues, we'll get 1 year of data, but eventually we'll hopefully have multiple years worth of data.
Yeah, so our immediate aspiration is obviously we'll add data from 2024, but then next year we'll start a new presidential term. And I should say that one of the reasons we broke it by presidential term is not just sort of pragmatic data science reasons, but actually there's a long line of political science research that shows that public opinion actually changes dramatically, in part based on the party of who controls the presidency. So in a Democratic presidency, public opinion tends to shift to the right. They tend to shift against the party in power. So we wanted to be able to show those sort of thermostatic changes in public opinion, and then kind of give you a sense of, during a presidential election year, what is the state of public opinion based on the last couple years of surveys.
Let's take a question here, and then maybe we can take a couple from online.
Hi, my name is Annika. I'm a bit confused about the target audience for this tool. Is it for the average citizen, or is it for legislators, like in particular? Because my gut is telling me that elected officials who are out of touch with reality are not going to be so gung-ho about using a tool that's available to the public. So I was just wondering about that.
I guess I'll start. In communities, I work a lot with groups like the NAACP, the League of Women Voters, Common Cause. My hope is that even if journalists and legislators are not there, that these sorts of groups can bring this data to the council members or state legislators and force it in their faces and say, I just want you to know. Honestly, just putting it into the legislative record, as somebody who litigates, there's a rule of evidence that means that if you get something into the legislative record, it's much easier to get it into court. So I'm always like, go on, people, put everything into the legislative record, and then I can put them on the stand and say, this was in front of you when you made that decision. Why did you make the decision the other way? I do think that we don't have to rely on the good natures of legislators, even though some are amazing.
Yeah, I guess just to follow up on that, even outside the legal framework, showing people some data can be a thing that an average person can do, is what we're trying to say. Like, this is now something you can do to your city councilor, to your state legislator, which maybe wasn't possible for an average person previously, but was possible for a lobbyist or someone else who is collecting their own independent and potentially biased data. So this is supposed to be an unbiased resource for the average person as well. Mm-hmm. So the answer is both, hopefully.
Okay, so online question.
Yeah.
In what ways do you think entrenched interests would critique or push back against this resource? I feel like maybe Michelle will have a sense.
Could you repeat it again?
Yeah, in what way would entrenched interests, I presume was that lobbyists, the cats, how would they critique or push back against the resource?
I think that, the horrible thing about the current state of affairs is that you could have beautiful data in front of you, And I think that you said it best. If you're entrenched in your views, what we've learned is that if you are highly intelligent, I'll share a small anecdote of coming to Harvard. I was just like, oh my God, we're going to find all these awesome people, and like people are going to be asking a lot of questions instead of like sharing what their perspective is. And I'm just like excited about being in a universe. And I love the smiles on people here that are already in the school, because you all know what happens, right? You go down to the JFK auditorium, and then people start, instead of asking questions, having like this long-winded explanation of why they're, and you have like somebody really important there, and then you're telling them what you're thinking. I love the sheepish laughs. So the reality is that the smarter you are, what I learned is, the harder you advocate to go against other people's opinions. And you have higher resources for you to just like figure out data that matches your ideals. So that's what people are gonna do. You're gonna have a beautiful tool like TrueViews, and people are going to go back to their groups, and they're going to do surveys with their groups to disprove unbiased information. The beautiful thing is, we know that. The powerful thing is, you know that too. And it is our job, again, collectively. I don't think that we talk enough about the responsibility that all of us have of saying, I really appreciate the fact that you have your sets of data and your data is coming from your constituency. Why don't we talk about this data that is unbiased? And then use the merits of that data. And that's the only way that we're gonna fight about it. But that's how people are gonna do it. They're gonna go back to their groups, and they're gonna look for their echo chamber. And they're gonna find data points that reflect what they think. Mm-hmm. This is where this tool is so important. This is where journalists need to use this tool. This is where the general public needs to use this tool to bring it back and say, I want you to use unbiased data.
Yeah, and I guess the only one thing I'd add is that what I hope about the tool is that people from both parties and of all political persuasions will find some data here that makes them really annoyed, that like disagrees with their prior conceptions about the world. And maybe that'll change their views a little bit, or maybe they'll take that out on us. And I think, if they get mad about something we did, that means that probably we're challenging their preconceptions in helpful ways.
How do you ensure that the population that responds to your questions is not biased simply by the fact that they are willing to respond to surveys?
I think that's a deep question about survey research that we don't pretend to have a unique take on. I mean, I think we're taking the survey data as given, and for the most part, we're assuming the survey firms have themselves spent a lot of time thinking about that, which I know because we're using high-quality academic surveys that they have spent a lot of time thinking about that.
Cool. We're trusting other people. So.
Yeah.
Do you intend for this always to be free and publicly available, or will you add a subscription or paid version as it expands? Free, people. Free.
Yeah, we're very thankful for generous support from the Bloomberg Center.
Yeah.
More questions, or should I wrap up? Justin, you're in charge.
Okay, maybe one or two more.
How does the plan for rolling out the platform leverage prior research showing how hard it is to get elected officials to change their positions?
I guess just the one thing I'd say, maybe building on what you guys said earlier, is that the elected officials are obviously one target audience of this, but there's a larger political universe out there that includes voters, all of us, that includes journalists, activists, nonprofits, and I think that our hope is that this will be useful for all of those different groups of people. With obviously we pretend politicians being one important group, but certainly not the only group.
Yeah, and I guess the flip side of that, someone's asked, how quickly does public opinion change? How should policymakers think about that in looking at this tool, right? I mean, we've shown a couple of years of data, but we obviously can't, well, maybe we can predict, but we're not currently predicting future public opinion. Yeah, I don't know, I guess if you're, a mayor of a small town, how would you think about that?
Changing
No, yeah, if people's opinions change, right? So like, as you provide more information to the public, maybe they didn't think this was a good idea before, but now they do. Is that something you've experienced in what you've done, like being able to get people to a new place?
I would say what I've learned is that when you go in to a community and you actually do the work of having crucial conversations and being willing to listen to somebody and not wanting to change their mind, it's amazing what happens, but it takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
It's not a rapid change. I'll also point us back to Kansas. Had a few years ago, when Governor Brownback was in office, we would have had the reproductive rights question on the ballot. More than likely, Kansans by and large, would have voted for us to have like an amendment to the Constitution making abortions illegal in the state. I think that all of the work that has been done over the last few years of demystifying what reproductive rights look like and helping people understand that many women that are in the horrible decision to trying to make a determination with regards to either continuing their pregnancy or terminating pregnancy because of health reasons is much more of the issue. That was never talked about. Abortion was a taboo issue. But journalists, people that were really passionate about this issue have spoken about it. That changed the sentiment, but that was several years. So we see that it can happen, but it takes time. So
yeah, I guess we'll see next year what happened for 2024's public opinion.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, I think we'll close out there. So thank you all to all of you for attending this event, for helping to get the word out about TrueViews. We're really thankful to the Bloomberg Center again. And Jorrit, I don't know if you have any closing comments for us, but feel free.
Well, first of all, thank you all panelists. Please join me in thanking Michelle, Justin, Chris, Ruth, and Nick for producing this tool and sharing your insights about it. We have some lunch for the people in person here. For everybody, please sign up for future events. The next event of the Bloomberg Center for Cities with the Institute of Politics is with the mayor of Taipei this coming Monday at 6 p.m. in the John F. Kennedy Jr. Forum. We hope to see you there. And please stay as long in the space as you want, and happy new academic year.
Thank you.
Thank you.